What if the very first thing you put into your body each morning, that comforting cup of coffee before breakfast, is quietly working against you in ways that have nothing to do with caffeine sensitivity or how many cups you drink? Most people assume coffee on an empty stomach is simply a matter of personal preference, something that either sits fine with you or gives you a bit of jitters, and beyond that, not much else to think about. But after 60, your digestive system, your stress hormones, and your blood sugar regulation have all shifted in ways that change how your body actually responds to that first cup, before a single bite of food has entered your stomach. So today we're going to walk through exactly what happens inside your body when you drink coffee on an empty stomach after 60, why this matters more now than it may have in your 30s or 40s, who should be particularly mindful of this habit, and how to enjoy your coffee in a way that works with your body rather than against it. Before we begin, remember this video is for education only. If you have acid reflux, gastritis, a history of ulcers, or are managing diabetes, please speak with your doctor about how coffee timing specifically fits into your individual situation. Now let's begin. Most people ask, is coffee bad for me? But that is actually the wrong question for this particular conversation because coffee itself, consumed reasonably, has a fairly well-established, largely neutral to positive relationship with health for most adults. The better question is, what specifically happens when coffee is the first thing to enter an empty stomach, rather than being consumed alongside or after food? And does that timing matter more after 60 than it did earlier in life? Because the empty stomach part of this equation changes the picture considerably, independent of coffee's other well-known effects. Here is why timing matters so much more after 60 specifically. Stomach acid production naturally becomes somewhat less predictable with age, for some people decreasing overall, while for others, particularly those with certain digestive conditions, becoming more prone to irritation from acidic foods and beverages. The stomach lining itself, called the gastric mucosa, tends to become slightly thinner and more vulnerable to irritation over time, a natural part of aging that varies considerably between individuals. Blood sugar regulation, including how efficiently your body manages the stress hormone cortisol, which coffee stimulates, tends to become less finely tuned after 60, meaning the cortisol elevating effect of coffee lands on a system that's already working somewhat differently than it did decades earlier. And many adults over 60 take one or more daily medications, some of which interact directly with either caffeine or an empty stomach in ways worth understanding specifically. Think of your stomach lining like the surface of a well-worn wooden cutting board that's been used for decades. A brand new cutting board can handle the occasional scrape or acidic ingredient without much consequence. Its surface still smooth and protective, but a cutting board that's been used for years develops small grooves, thin spots, and areas where the protective sealing has worn away, meaning the same acidic ingredient that caused no issue years ago might now seep in more easily and cause more noticeable irritation. Your stomach lining after 60 can behave somewhat similarly, not damaged or dysfunctional by any means, but simply less uniformly protected than it was decades earlier, which is exactly why what you put into an empty stomach first thing in the morning deserves a bit more consideration now than it may have required in the past. Let's start with the first thing that happens when coffee hits an empty stomach, and it involves stomach acid directly. Coffee, regardless of whether it's caffeinated or decaffeinated, stimulates the production of stomach acid, partly through its natural compounds and partly through the simple act of consuming something warm and stimulating first thing in the morning. On a full stomach, this acid has food to interact with and help buffer, moderating its direct contact with the stomach lining. On an empty stomach, that same acid has nothing to work on except the stomach lining itself, which can lead to a burning sensation, discomfort, or a general feeling of an unsettled stomach for some people, particularly those whose stomach lining has become somewhat more sensitive with age, as discussed a moment ago. This is one of the most immediately noticeable effects for people who experience any digestive discomfort from morning coffee, and it's a large part of why so many people report feeling considerably better when they simply add a small amount of food before or alongside their first cup. The second thing that happens involves your gut lining more broadly, beyond just acid production specifically. Coffee's natural acidity and certain compounds within it can have a mild irritating effect on the lining of your digestive tract when consumed without any food present to provide a protective buffer. For most healthy adults, this effect is mild and not particularly consequential. However, for adults with existing conditions like gastritis, acid reflux, or a history of ulcers, conditions that become somewhat more common after 60, this mild irritation can be considerably more noticeable, sometimes contributing to symptoms like heartburn, an uncomfortable fullness, or a burning sensation that persists well beyond the time it takes to finish your cup. The third thing that happens involves cortisol, your primary stress hormone, and this connects directly back to the natural morning cortisol surge that's already happening in your body regardless of coffee. Caffeine itself triggers an additional release of cortisol, layering on top of your body's already naturally elevated morning cortisol levels. For most adults, this additional cortisol boost from coffee is part of what produces that familiar sense of alertness and readiness many people rely on to start their day. However, after 60, your body's baseline cortisol regulation tends to become somewhat less efficient, meaning this additional caffeine-driven cortisol spike, layered directly onto an already elevated natural morning surge, with nothing yet in your stomach to moderate the pace of caffeine absorption, can produce a more pronounced, sometimes jittery or anxious feeling for some people, compared to drinking that same coffee after eating something first. The fourth thing that happens involves blood sugar, an area particularly relevant for anyone managing diabetes or prediabetes, though it's worth understanding even without those specific conditions. Coffee, particularly on an empty stomach, has been shown in some research to produce a temporary increase in blood sugar levels and a temporary decrease in insulin sensitivity, meaning your body's ability to efficiently move sugar out of your bloodstream and into your cells becomes somewhat less effective for a period after consuming coffee without food. This effect appears to be more pronounced when coffee is consumed on a completely empty stomach compared to alongside a meal, likely related to the combined effect of caffeine's direct impact on insulin sensitivity and the additional cortisol release already discussed, since cortisol itself plays a role in raising blood sugar levels as part of its broader stress response function. For adults managing blood sugar concerns specifically, this is one of the more clinically relevant reasons to consider having a small amount of food before or alongside that first cup of coffee, rather than drinking it entirely on its own. The fifth thing that happens involves hydration, an area that becomes increasingly relevant after 60, since the sense of thirst naturally becomes somewhat less reliable with age, making many older adults more prone to mild, chronic dehydration without fully realizing it. Coffee has a mild diuretic effect, meaning it can modestly increase urine output, particularly in people who don't consume caffeine regularly. When coffee is the very first fluid you consume after a full night of sleep, a period during which you've already gone many hours without any fluid intake, this mild diuretic effect layers onto a body that's already in a somewhat dehydrated state upon waking. This doesn't mean coffee is significantly dehydrating for regular coffee drinkers, since research suggests the diuretic effect becomes considerably blunted with habitual consumption, but it does mean that having a glass of water before your coffee, particularly first thing in the morning, helps address that overnight fluid deficit more directly than coffee alone. The sixth thing that happens involves specific medications many adults over 60 take regularly, an area worth particular attention since coffee's interaction with an empty stomach can meaningfully affect how certain medications are absorbed. Some medications, including certain thyroid medications, are specifically recommended to be taken on an empty stomach with water alone, with coffee delayed by 30 minutes to an hour afterward, since coffee can interfere with the absorption of these particular medications, sometimes significantly reducing their effectiveness if taken too close together. Certain medications for osteoporosis carry similar timing recommendations. This is a highly specific medication-dependent consideration, meaning the right answer depends entirely on what you personally take, which is exactly why reviewing your own medication timing with your doctor or pharmacist, rather than assuming general coffee advice applies universally, is particularly worthwhile if you take any regular morning medication. Now let's talk about the seventh thing that happens, and this one involves your nervous system's transition from the calm, parasympathetic state of sleep into the more alert, sympathetic state needed for daytime activity. Coffee accelerates and intensifies this transition, which is part of why it feels so effective at increasing alertness. However, when this transition happens abruptly, through coffee consumed within moments of waking, before any of the gentler transitional steps like hydration, gradual movement, or a few minutes of quiet breathing, the shift from calm to alert can feel more jarring and can contribute to a sense of underlying jitteriness or restlessness for the first portion of your morning, particularly for those more sensitive to caffeine's effects, a sensitivity that can become somewhat more pronounced with age due to slower caffeine metabolism in some individuals. Now let's talk about the eighth and final consideration, which involves the actual sensory and psychological experience of your morning coffee, an aspect that matters for genuine quality of life, not just physiological mechanisms. For many people, that first cup of coffee represents a genuinely enjoyable, comforting ritual, a moment of quiet before the demands of the day begin. This psychological and emotional value is real and worth honoring, meaning the goal of today's discussion is not to suggest eliminating your morning coffee ritual entirely, but rather adjusting the small details around it, what comes before it, what accompanies it, and how it's timed relative to any medications, so that this enjoyable ritual works with your body's needs rather than inadvertently working against them. Now, before we go further, let's debunk a few common myths about coffee and empty stomachs specifically. For years, many people believed that coffee must always be consumed immediately upon waking to be effective, and that any delay reduces its benefit. Some believed that if coffee doesn't cause immediate, obvious discomfort, it must not be affecting the stomach or digestive system at all. Some believed that decaffeinated coffee eliminates all of these considerations entirely, since caffeine itself isn't present. And some believed that everyone responds to coffee on an empty stomach in exactly the same way, regardless of individual digestive health or medication use. But when we look at the actual mechanisms involved, the picture becomes considerably more individualized. The real questions are not simply, do I feel fine right now, or is this simply personal preference with no deeper explanation? The better questions are, does my stomach have any existing sensitivity, such as reflux or a history of ulcers, that makes empty stomach acid exposure particularly relevant for me? Am I managing blood sugar concerns that make the insulin sensitivity effect worth considering? Do I take any morning medications with specific timing recommendations relative to caffeine? And notably, decaffeinated coffee still contains many of the same acidic compounds responsible for stomach lining irritation, meaning switching to decaf addresses the caffeine-specific effects, like the cortisol surge and nervous system transition, but doesn't fully eliminate the acid-related digestive considerations discussed earlier. Now let's build a simple, practical approach for enjoying your morning coffee in a way that works better with your body after 60. First, drink a glass of water before your coffee, addressing the mild overnight dehydration already discussed and helping to buffer your stomach slightly before introducing coffee's acidity. Second, have a small amount of food, even something as simple as a few crackers, a piece of toast, or a small piece of fruit, before or alongside your coffee, rather than on a completely empty stomach, giving your stomach acid something to interact with beyond the stomach lining itself. Third, if you take any morning medications, particularly thyroid medication or osteoporosis medication, check with your doctor or pharmacist about the specific recommended timing relative to coffee, since this can meaningfully affect medication absorption and effectiveness. Fourth, if you notice any burning sensation, discomfort, or unsettled feeling after your morning coffee, consider whether the food before coffee adjustment alone resolves this, and if not, mention the pattern to your doctor, since it may reflect an underlying digestive sensitivity worth evaluating. Fifth, if you're managing diabetes or prediabetes, pay particular attention to how your blood sugar responds to coffee on an empty stomach specifically, since the insulin sensitivity effect discussed earlier may be more relevant for your individual situation. Sixth, consider allowing a few minutes of hydration and gentle movement before your first cup, rather than reaching for coffee within seconds of waking, allowing your nervous system a slightly more gradual transition into daytime alertness. Let's talk a bit more about the specific timing recommendation for anyone taking thyroid medication, since this is one of the more clinically significant and commonly relevant considerations discussed today, affecting a meaningful number of adults over 60 given how common thyroid conditions become at this stage of life. Most thyroid medications are recommended to be taken first thing in the morning, on a truly empty stomach, with plain water only, followed by a waiting period of 30 minutes to an hour before consuming coffee, food, or other medications. This is because coffee, along with certain foods and supplements like calcium or iron, can bind with thyroid medication in the digestive tract and meaningfully reduce how much of the medication your body actually absorbs, potentially undermining the medication's effectiveness even if you're taking the correct dose. If you take thyroid medication and haven't specifically discussed coffee timing with your doctor or pharmacist, this is a conversation worth having directly, since the interaction is significant enough to potentially affect your thyroid hormone levels over time if consistently timed too closely together. Let's talk briefly about caffeine metabolism specifically, since this changes meaningfully with age and helps explain why some people notice they've become more sensitive to coffee over the years, even without changing how much they drink. The liver enzyme primarily responsible for breaking down caffeine tends to become somewhat less efficient with age, meaning caffeine can remain active in your bloodstream longer after 60 compared to earlier decades of life. This slower metabolism means that same morning cup of coffee may produce a more prolonged effect on your nervous system, your heart rate, and your cortisol levels than it once did. And it also means that afternoon or evening caffeine consumption is more likely to interfere with sleep quality later that night, since the caffeine hasn't fully cleared your system by bedtime. This doesn't necessarily mean you need to reduce your coffee intake if you're not experiencing any negative effects, but it does help explain why some longtime coffee drinkers notice new jitteriness, sleep disruption, or digestive sensitivity emerging later in life, even without any change to their actual coffee habits, simply because their body is processing that same amount of caffeine somewhat differently than it used to. It's also worth addressing quantity specifically, since the empty stomach considerations discussed today become more relevant as the amount of coffee consumed increases. General guidance for healthy adults typically suggests up to about 400 milligrams of caffeine per day, roughly equivalent to 3 to 4 regular cups of coffee, as a reasonable upper limit associated with a good safety profile for most people. However, for adults over 60 managing any of the specific considerations discussed today, including blood pressure concerns, anxiety sensitivity, or sleep difficulties, a more moderate amount, particularly concentrated earlier in the day and consumed alongside food rather than on an empty stomach, tends to be a more comfortable and sustainable approach than pushing toward that upper general limit. If you're drinking multiple cups throughout the morning, the empty stomach considerations apply most directly to that very first cup, since subsequent cups are generally consumed after some food has already entered your stomach, providing at least some buffering effect for the acid-related concerns discussed earlier. Let's also briefly mention that coffee is not the only common morning substance that interacts meaningfully with an empty stomach, since many adults over 60 also take daily aspirin or other over-the-counter pain relievers for various reasons. Similar to coffee's effect on the stomach lining, certain pain relievers, particularly non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, can also irritate the stomach lining more significantly when taken without food present. If your morning routine involves both coffee and a daily medication like this, having food present becomes even more relevant, since you're potentially combining two substances that each carry some degree of stomach lining irritation risk on an empty stomach, an effect that may be more than simply additive for some individuals. Without any noticeable discomfort or issue, if you have no digestive symptoms, no relevant medication timing concerns, and no blood sugar management needs, your current pattern may simply continue working well for you, and there's no need to force a change purely based on general guidance that may not apply meaningfully to your specific situation. The considerations discussed today are most relevant for people experiencing some degree of digestive discomfort, managing blood sugar concerns, or taking medications with specific timing requirements, rather than a universal recommendation that everyone must follow regardless of their individual experience. And what about people who have already switched to drinking coffee with food and still notice some digestive discomfort? In this situation, it's worth considering other variables beyond just the empty stomach question, including the specific type of coffee. Since darker roasts tend to be somewhat less acidic than lighter roasts, the brewing method, since cold brew coffee is generally less acidic than hot brewed coffee due to differences in the extraction process, and the overall quantity consumed, since even coffee consumed alongside food can still produce noticeable symptoms in someone with a more significant underlying digestive sensitivity, which may be worth discussing with your doctor rather than assuming timing alone will fully resolve the issue. Let's also briefly mention alternatives worth considering if you find that coffee on an empty stomach consistently causes discomfort even after trying these adjustments, without wanting to give up your morning ritual entirely. Some people find that switching to a lower acid coffee, brewed using a cold brew method, or gradually reducing the strength of their coffee while maintaining the ritual and routine they value, offers a reasonable middle ground. Others find that herbal tea or a small amount of warm water with lemon before their coffee provides some of the same comforting, ritualistic morning experience while giving their stomach a gentler transition before the coffee itself. Now let's summarize everything in a simple way. Drinking coffee on an empty stomach after 60 triggers several specific effects worth understanding, including increased stomach acid production without food to buffer it, potential mild irritation to a stomach lining that may already be somewhat more sensitive with age, an additional cortisol release layered onto your body's already elevated natural morning surge, a temporary reduction in insulin sensitivity that's particularly relevant for blood sugar management, a mild diuretic effect that compounds with overnight dehydration, potential interference with certain medications like thyroid medication if taken too closely together, and a more abrupt nervous system transition from sleep into daytime alertness. For most healthy adults without specific digestive sensitivities, blood sugar concerns, or relevant medication timing needs, these effects are relatively mild and may not require significant change. But for adults managing reflux, gastritis, diabetes, or thyroid medication specifically, a few simple adjustments, a glass of water first, a small amount of food alongside your coffee, and attention to medication timing, can meaningfully reduce discomfort and support better overall outcomes, without requiring you to give up your morning coffee ritual altogether. But remember, the goal here is not to make your morning routine feel complicated or clinical. It's simply to understand what's actually happening in your body during that first cup, so you can make small, informed adjustments if you're experiencing discomfort, rather than assuming any digestive symptoms are simply something to accept and push through indefinitely. So tomorrow morning, before you reach for that first cup, try drinking a glass of water first, and consider having a small bite of something, even just a few crackers or a piece of fruit, before or alongside your coffee. If you take any morning medications, take a moment to check whether their timing relative to coffee has ever been specifically discussed with your doctor or pharmacist. Small adjustments like these can help your favorite morning ritual continue supporting your day, rather than working against your body's needs. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you typically drink your coffee first thing on an empty stomach? Or do you already have food beforehand? Have you noticed any digestive discomfort or difference depending on your approach? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may help someone else watching this video adjust their own morning coffee ritual for the better. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe to Nutri, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more simple, practical health strategies for adults over 60. And next, watch our video on what happens when you take a cold shower every day after 60, because how you begin your morning, from that first sip to that first splash of water, plays a bigger role in how your whole day unfolds than most people ever realize.